Hi there, I'm John, and today I'll be providing an analysis of my infographic on humpback whales. The first half of this video will be covering each of my individual elements and how they utilize visual potential as well as emulation of the models I have selected. The second half of this video will be then going into a more holistic approach of my entire infographic and how it utilizes unity, variety, alignment, and visual hierarchy to bring my elements onto the page together. First, I'd like to discuss the general characteristics of my color, visual language, type, and layout models, and how they apply to all of the elements that I've created. Later on, I will discuss the more specific aspects of emulation between my models and certain elements. The first model I'd like to discuss is my color model, which uses a mix of yellow, blue, gray, and white in a complementary color scheme. As you can tell, the background color is a dark blue as the predominant color, with yellow used for the main points within the elements. Then, gray is used as a background secondary for some of the elements distinctly. And lastly, white is used as a highlighting color throughout the entire piece, as well as to contrast the yellow in certain data points that are being compared. Next is my visual language model. This model primarily has rounded textures in the headers, illustrations, and elements of the piece, as well as flat textures with no outlining occurring. The level of detail is mainly unrealistic, with cartoonish shapes that are recognizable but not actually realistic. Lastly is the lining. This piece uses sparse lining, but where it is used is thick lines for progression throughout the piece, and thin lines for the annotations. Now I'd like to talk about my typography model. This model uses a sans serif font for its title, header, body text, and labels. I chose this model because it fit my visual language model well, with simplistic style and flat texturing, even on the fonts. One thing to note is the difference in size between the labels and the headers, as well as the difference between even labels of different aspects of the piece. One challenge I ran into with this model was the very ambiguous use of labeling throughout. I interpreted these white text areas as labels, mainly for precision purposes, and thus I ran into the problem of having no real identity labels to go off of. Here's a general breakdown of the text used in my typography model. As you can tell, the titles, headers, and body text all use different styles of Museo sans, while the labels consist of Latha bold with all capitalization, or some lowercase used infrequently. As I mentioned before, the general font sizes ranges in the same area approximately, but you can tell that the labels have both sizes that are larger and smaller than the headers. Now I'm going to talk about each of the elements I've created and how they manipulate visual potential as well as the emulation of the models I have just discussed. This first element uses numbers as a form of visual potential. The main takeaway I wanted to make from this piece was that humpback whales, despite being baleen whales, eat a large amount of small fish. I did this through a breakdown, proportionally, of their diet, comparing small fish and krill in the main element. Despite being area-based, this uses proportions to compare the two areas in percentages. Then I use a radial donut chart to compare the actual different types of fish they consume, with different segments being different sizes for the area. I chose these two types of encodings because I thought they fit my visual language well as matching the data that I wanted to represent in the correct fashion, such as the way that the bottom main element depicts the certain proportion that I wanted to represent for consumption, as well as the top element being more informative and less trying to highlight a point. I then emulated my color model in this piece by using the same themes of white highlighting to denote the information I thought was important, most specifically in the small fish area, as well as using a gray background, like my color model uses for some of its elements. However, I do believe this detracted somewhat from my color model in the use of whites within the donut chart, which were mainly for the purpose of contrasting the different data points. However, I don't believe that these certain white aspects are more important than the other elements. I then emulated my visual language model in two different ways with this piece. One being this area that matches the similar style of mapping over here in the fill, as well as the standard radial chart used up here for the donut chart. One critique I got was that the borders between the areas, in both areas, shouldn't be flat lines, much like the same way that there's a curved line within my visual language model. To remedy this, I used a style of small wave texture between the area boundaries. Lastly, I used labeling in two different ways from this, much like my visual language model, with both text on the inside of circles and filling areas, as well as using pointers for areas where the text would not fit well inside of the circle. I then emulated my typography model with the same style of all uppercase labels, as well as a varying size of labels based on the importance of the data I believed. Here is my second piece that uses numbers as a form of visual potential. Here, instead of using proportional values, I'm using amounts and sizes for encoding of numbers. As you can see, the larger value has more tails to it, as well as a larger tail growth. This mainly supports my visual language model, which is used a very similar style, and I would argue that it somewhat detracts from the actual understanding of the data, and amounts or size should have been used instead of both in conjunction here. This piece somewhat goes away from the general use of colors within my color model, mainly in the way my tails are gray, when normally you'd expect a white or yellow coloring for the main numbers piece. I went with this because my critiques generally thought that the white and yellow contrasting was not great enough when you're trying to use amount encoding within a piece. So instead I opted to use the white and yellow text to actually denote the differences between the two. Again, this piece primarily emulates my visual language model with the same usage of symbols to denote the different scales occurring, as well as the general layout of the piece, with labels being used both inside the tails as well as in a larger text area. This segues into my use of typography emulation as well, where everything in this piece is in all capitalization, just like my typography model would use for labels, despite having larger phrases. But this is very similar to my typography model elements. Lastly, although this is subtle, this also emulates my typography model because of the way that I have a larger font size for the numbers than I actually have for the phrase itself. This comes straight from my typography model, where some elements have number values that are larger than the rest of the label itself for the reference. Now I'd like to talk about my relationship display. This display actually has a couple different subtle uses of encoding for the relationships occurring. The most obvious is the lines that connect the different elements. These lines all have the same standard of sizing because they generally have the same relationships between different elements. However, a more subtle use is the shapes occurring. The circular shapes are the ones that are just in different families of the genetic hierarchy. However, the silhouettes actually represent living species at the moment. While it might be expected that a kind of display like this would be top to bottom like a general family tree, I chose to go left to right because it both fit the silhouette styling as well as was a general suggestion from the critiques I received to make it more visually appealing on the page, with the text fitting better within the areas. This piece, like all my others, uses white for the highlighting of important details. More specifically, the humpback whale is the only element on the page that is white, and makes it the most obvious and easy to tell from the rest of the display. However, one part that detracts in this piece from my color model is the use of these darker colored lines. This is mainly due to the suggestions I received to make the lines opaque, much like the lines used in my visual language model, as well as thicker than I normally have them. This piece also emulates my visual language model in the same way of using a circular theme occurring, as well as somewhat unrealistic silhouettes occurring. One of the challenges I faced was having to use silhouettes that were distinguishable as different animals, while also still having the same style as my visual language model. I think that's one of the greatest detractions I have with this piece specifically from my visual language model, in how the silhouettes could be somewhat too realistic. But again, making them any less detailed would make them difficult to understand and hard to tell at a glance. Lastly, I emulated my typography model again through the use of all capitalized labels within each of the pieces, while the actual body text on the bottom describing the situation uses a mixed case standard. Next, I'd like to talk about my element that uses the visual potential of location. Now, since my topic is humpback whales of the Pacific, I wanted to use a map of the Pacific Ocean, but a challenge I ran into quickly was that people don't immediately understand what a map of the Pacific Ocean looks like. I solved this problem by adding a globe shape to the outside of the map, which had the added benefit of somewhat resembling my visual language model more than if it were a standard square. Within the map itself, I have elements of varying sizes for the numbers themselves. This is the main encoding of numbers within the display. However, people found it ambiguous what the size is actually denoted, so I added annotations to avoid having an actual scale, which would go against my visual language model, and the annotations themselves include the number sizes of certain elements to help provide a scale to the entire piece. This piece also emulates my color model well through the use of the standard gray background that sometimes occurs in my color model, while the white is used for the center highlighting, and I can use the yellow as a fill color for the countries around the sides. As I mentioned before, this location element also emulates my visual language model in a mix of two different parts. The first is the circular map occurring on one of the elements from the visual language model, which doesn't exactly fit the same styling, which is where the secondary map comes in, with more detail as also as more holistic view of a certain region. Lastly, I use the same style of pointers again as my visual language model to add annotations to certain parts of the map. This element also follows the standard conventions of my typography model, with an all capitalization, somewhat large label in the center, where the body text is smaller but mixed case. Next, I'd like to talk about my illustrations and how they utilize the visual potential of appearance. Now, the main important point of appearance as a form of visual potential is that it's a recognizable shape that denotes what the topic is supposed to be about. Prior to selecting this topic, I did not fully understand what was required to make a silhouette recognizable as a humpback whale, but through the process of selection, I figured out that there's three main aspects that make a humpback whale distinguishable from other silhouettes. Those three aspects are a prominent back dorsal fin, a large tail proportional to the body, as well as large fins proportional to the body, that make this stand out from other types of whales, as well as recognizable as a silhouette in general. After selecting the appropriate silhouette, the main challenge I had was making it match my visual language model, since my visual language model has illustrations that are largely cartoonish, or not realistic very much, and having to find a balance between making my silhouette still recognizable as a whale, but match my visual language model in terms of smoothness, roundness, as well as unrealisticness within the silhouette. Then, after picking the general shape I wanted, I had to choose my color model emulation, which proved fairly easy since yellow is the second most predominant color on my model and matched very well with the blue background. My last element utilizes the visual potential of time. Unlike most standard encodings of time, I chose a period that was cyclical in nature and thus decided to use a circle to denote the time period of a year. Then, for the sections, each section is proportional to that segment of the year. One of the challenges I faced with this element was showing how the time progressed throughout the year and the importance of different sections of the year. This solution ultimately came in the use of an outside ring that denoted each month of the year that correlated to the different sections that were highlighted. Then, I used these whale tails as a form of arrow almost to show the progression throughout the piece. The main point I was trying to highlight with this piece was the duration between the winter and summer resting areas, and that is why I chose to use these areas as white for my color model to highlight these distinct parts. Additionally, I also used white to highlight the states to denote the distance to some amount. This piece also emulates my typography model through the use of labels that are in all uppercase, while the further body text below them, to further accentuate the point, is in mixed case. Additionally, the center text in the middle follows the same conventions as a header within my typography model, despite there also being a header at the top. This became a challenge in this piece because there were so many different levels of text, but I decided that the center was so relevant that it should probably consider itself a header, because it was relevant to the entire piece. Lastly, I feel like this piece detracted most from my visual language model, mainly because of how detailed it became. In my visual language model, most of the pieces are very simplistic in nature, with very little occurring. However, I believed this piece deserved the detail it needed in order to actually accentuate the points I wanted to highlight. And there are some parallels between the two. Mainly, you can tell that the use of the months around the outside matches the same type of symbology used around some of the circles within my visual language model. Additionally, there is some precedent set of using symbols within the actual circle itself to denote transitions between points. One of the areas that was the largest challenges for me was how to fit text within the circle to match my visual language model while making it legible still. In my visual language model, every circle has text that wraps facing outwards. However, this did not work well for a piece that has multiple segments of text. So instead I have some elements that face inwards and some outwards for legibility purposes. Now that I've talked about each of my individual elements, I'd like to discuss the layout model I used to bring the entire piece together. This layout model uses lines for the sections between the different areas, with no color backgrounds for sectioning. The main layout of this model consists of columns on the right and left sides with a large space in the center for a main piece. One thing to note is that the elements in the left and right sides are varying sizes, and thus the vertical symmetry is thrown off, while the horizontal is still intact. Additionally, the elements themselves are used to section within the columns, such as these lines used from the data points to actually section out between the areas. Now I'd like to talk about the alignment of my layout model. As you can see, the vertical alignment is left aligned to the left side of each of the columns with a margin of the same size on each of the aspects, while the right side is fairly scattered and matching all the way to the side of the column in some cases. The horizontal alignment is then fairly consistent across the top, but across the center pieces, there's random horizontal alignment occurring between the two columns that doesn't match with the center very much. Within my infographic, I followed a very similar style for the layout, with columns of equal size on the left and right, and a large center column for our main piece. Although my layout model used lines to section out the different elements on the left and right columns, I decided that I could use my headers from my visual language model to use better sectioning that still matched somewhat with the way the elements themselves sectioned out the columns. I also used the same style of lines that went from the left side and came down on the right side of each column, but still had the same styling of lines for my visual language model with a thick line and slightly opaque. One of the benefits of this layout model was it also allowed visual hierarchy to come forth very easily, mainly in that my location display is the main piece of my infographic and adds visual hierarchy very well with just its sheer size compared to the rest of the elements on the page. Additionally, the varying size of the elements in the columns themselves adds more visual hierarchy to the entire page, with certain elements that are larger taking up more precedence on the page than others. When building my elements, I tried to make sure that they were all visually different in some way to add variety to the page, while keeping the style consistent across all of them, to keep the unity of the entire infographic in place. Unity came pretty naturally through the use of the color model, and how I kept a consistent theme of white highlighting in each of my elements. I created variety within my infographic through the different shapes of my elements, such as the circular shapes on the bottom, with more lined and connected shapes on the top. Additionally, there's a general theme of silhouettes throughout each of the pieces that stay fairly consistent in their level of detail and realism. And adhering to my visual language model on every one of my elements added unity as well, in the same consistent style of fills with no outlines, as well as very rounded edges. Now I'd like to talk about the alignment of my infographic. Much like my layout model, I tried to use the same style of left-aligned margins on the left side of each column. However, one place where I detracted from my layout model was using a right margin as well on each of the sides that also made a right alignment for each of the columns. I decided to use this because my infographic would look very scattered unlike the layout model, due to the way my elements are formed in very symmetrical ways on their own. Additionally, I used the same layout styling for horizontal alignment, with the top being all aligned, but once you reach the actual elements, the alignment in the horizontal becomes fairly scattered and random between different elements on the page on the left and right columns, with very little alignment occurring with the elements in the right and the center. The last thing I'd like to talk about is how my infographic as a whole emulates my models. With respect to my color model, I think I emulated it fairly well with the same use of white for highlighting as well as the yellow and whites for contrasting data points. Similarly, I used the same style of gray backgrounds for some of the elements, but not all of them. However, I do believe there are some areas where I didn't match the color model exactly, such as in some elements where the white and yellow gets mixed, or some areas where the gray is used for the actual number pieces themselves. Additionally, there were some colors from my color model that I did not have the chance to use at all, such as a darker shade of yellow and a darker shade of blue that only occurred within my model very sparsely and with specific lining and details that I did not have the opportunity to use with my visual language model of very flat textures. With respect to my visual language model, overall I believe my elements came out too detailed compared to the elements of my visual language model. This I largely attribute to the data sets used, such as in my visual language model largely having one or two numbers, whereas my data sets largely came out to 6 or 7, and thus required much more detail to accentuate the different points, in conjunction with my limited color scheme. However, there are a couple points from my visual language model that I pulled into my final infographic. For instance, the headers match the exact same style of headers from my visual language model, and I like them a lot, and I think they fit very well. Similarly, the background texture is very subtle, much like my visual language model. And lastly, I used the same conventions of mix between pointers in some areas, as well as labels within the actual circles themselves for some of my elements. The last large issue I faced when making this infographic was emulating my typography model well. As mentioned previously, My typography model had very abstract uses of precision and identity labels throughout, and I tried to match the same styling. However, I ran into some challenges with legibility that caused me to have to detract from my typography model even more. But I tried to keep this consistent style of using labels with all capitalization where other details would be then listed in mixed case. Overall, I believe I could have matched my models closer, but the more important part to me was having each of my elements match each other in order to make a more unified visualization in the end. I am very happy with the final result, and I believe all the elements work very well in conjunction to give a very holistic view of humpback whales of the Pacific Ocean.